Welcome to another episode of States and Migration in Europe. Today we are diving into the recent French elections, a topic that has significant implications not only for France, but also for the European Union at large. Joining me today is Julien Navarro, a distinguished political scientist and professor at Lille Catholic University. He has just published an article on European Parliament elections, published in the journal European Union Politics. You will find the link in the description of this episode. In this episode, we will explore what has happened in France since the European elections of the 9th of June, 1 month ago. Then President Macron called for early elections for the National Assembly. We'll analyze the reasons of the decision, analyze the ensuing legislative elections, the results, and the possible prospects for the country now. So, Julien, welcome. Congratulations for your article, and thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on the recent political developments in France.
Thank you for having me in your program, Emmanuel.
So, let's start immediately with what has happened in the last months in France. So we had European elections on the 9th of June. And as Julien writes in his recently published article, the big characteristics of European election is that they are secondary in nature. They are not central in the national political debate. The European Parliament was elected at the universal suffrage primarily because European policymakers and German policymakers in particular wanted to strengthen the European level to give it an identity among national voters. But this vote doesn't really imply major political competencies for the European Parliament. So interestingly, what Julien studied in his recently published article is how European elections interact with other kinds of elections, especially national elections, and how this affects participation. Here we have a unique case in which a European election, a European Parliament election, led to major changes in French political life, with President Macron deciding on the evening of the vote, 1 month ago, 9th of June, to call for early legislative election as a result of the very poor score of his own party and the very high score of Marine Le Pen's and Jordan Bardella's national rally, who had more than 30%, almost 32% of the vote. So the question we will first discuss with Julien is, why did Mr. Macron took this decision? So many commentators, even today, after the results of the legislative election, say this was a big mistake, one of the biggest mistakes of the Fifth Republic in France. He had a respectable group at the National Assembly, even though he did not have a majority, and he torpedoed his own political family with no prospect of having a better score than he had in 2022. So that a kind of analysis we hear here and there. So I think, Julien, you will tell us what you think. Let me introduce my own hypothesis about that. I don't know exactly what happened in Emmanuel Macron's head on the 9th of June and probably in the weeks or even months before. But there is something striking, which is that if you look at the National Rally or National Front, as it used to be called, they tend to have very important electoral breakthrough in European Parliament elections. I think we can make the history of the rise of this party with three important European elections. First, the 1984 elections, which saw the party gaining nearly 11% of the vote. Until then, it was a 1 to 2% party, and they moved to 11% around the European elections of 1983. Obviously, there were also the municipal election of 1983 with highly mediatic cases like in Dreux, in which the National Front was had make a very big score, but it's really at the national level with the European elections of 1984 that party became a major party in French politics. Then it remained almost in that range for the following 20 to 30 years due to various developments, but between 11 and 17% or so. And then we had the 2014 elections, again, European Parliament elections, in which the party suddenly moved beyond its glass ceiling and received something like 24% of the vote. And after that, Marine Le Pen was proud to declare that her party was the first party of France, le premier parti de France, the first party of France. And this occurred with the European election in 2014. And now we have the third European elections, 2024, which is a party and its allies, sister party, I think, of Zemmour's party, for instance, which are made of people who were inside the National Front before. They were almost at 40% altogether. If you take Florian Philippot's party, Marine Le Pen's party, Éric Zemmour's party, and Debout la France of Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, which has become gradually absorbed in the Marine Le Pen's movement, they were nearly at 40% in European elections. So it's close to the score that she had in 2022, but it was the second round of the presidential election. Here it's just the first round. First round with that score was a real breakthrough. So that was officially and in parallel, Mr. Macron had an inverse result with his candidate making something like 14%. Julien, I think 14% of the vote. So it was a real defeat, and so that's why the first reason why officially he decided to dissolve the National Assembly. But if we want to make some calculations here, and again, I am not saying that it's what occurred in his mind, but why do voters vote like that in European election? Why is it that a party like National Rally makes this big score in European elections? And precisely, and it's what you explain in your paper, Julien, is because it's a second order vote. So a number of voters have a protest to express, but they don't really trust the National Rally because it's not, they consider it's not a very serious party to govern. And so they vote like that for a vote which is not crucial politically. The European Parliament is far away. It doesn't have major political powers, but they vote like that to express protest. But then the party manages to capitalize on this result and stay at this level later. So one explanation could be that Macron then decided to try to break this dynamic and call immediately for much more important elections in order to bring down this party, prevent this party from capitalizing on the results of the European elections. Is it something that you think could have occurred? Is it a possible explanation of what has occurred, Julien? What do you think?
Well, certainly what these recent elections, European elections and then legislative elections show is really to what extent these different levels of government have become intertwined. And actually, going back to the theory of second order elections, which you reminded now, this theory, the basic assumption is that European elections are closely connected to what is going on at the national level. This is why they are called second order national elections. So what happens at the European level is closely connected to what happens at the national level, and to some extent, and this is maybe what has become clearer now, also the way around. What happens at the European level can have an impact on what happens at the national level. Now, there are well-established, well-known reasons why a party such as the National Rally, formerly the Front National, National Front, has success in generally has a larger success at the European level than at the national level. That has to do with, first of all, concerning France, the electoral system, which is completely different. And that's something that should not be underestimated. And I will probably come back later on to the effect of the electoral system that we have at the national level in France.
I agree with that, but nevertheless, their score always goes a step further in European election, 11, 24, 32, and then this score lead to a specific result because of what you say of the different of the proportional system. But they also make a step further in this type of elections.
Of course. I mean, there is a dynamic that is. I mean, there are two things. There is a context that enables the national rally to be present and to be successful in the election, and then there is a trend which is connected to many factors. I mean, populist parties have been growing in different countries in Europe, so that's one factor that needs to be explained as such. There is a strategy of the national rally to try to appear as a normal party, as a party that is able to govern, so to get rid of the most negative image that it had. And thirdly, I would say there is maybe also the strategies of the other parties regarding the national rally.
Yeah, I mean, this is the overall trend of the progression. But yeah, I think, the reason why they make big steps at European elections is because, and we saw that with the final result of the legislative election, is that voters want to vote for them to protest, but there are still many voters who don't really think that they are fit to govern the country. So it's a way to protest, but not really. And to some extent, Emmanuel Macron was probably calling out the bluff of some of their voters. That is, are you really serious that you want to vote for them? To some extent, many were, but not enough, so that they gain an absolute majority in the final round of the legislative elections. But there are other possible explanations of the dissolution by Macron. So he wanted to break perhaps the dynamic of the national rally after those European elections, perhaps, but also those who say, oh, he should not have dissolved, it's a big stupidity. I mean, I think we need to understand the situation in which he was. I follow French politics from abroad now, and the way the pension reform was passed last year was also heavily discussed abroad, especially with the use of this constitutional instrument, the 49.3 decrees, which allows to make a substantial change in law without a vote of the National Assembly. So Macron was increasingly cornered into a very narrow room of maneuver in what he could do in this system. And it's not how you have a relative majority in the lower house, and so you can govern. It's not only that. Politics is more complex than that. If there is clearly in the country a majority against you, you have a lot of problems. So not only he did not have an absolute majority in the lower house, but he had also clearly a majority of French people against him. And when they were against the pension reforms, the pension reform discussions, I remember that there were demonstrators who had openly the objective to take over the Élysée Palace. So it required a massive deployment of police forces in the center of Paris to prevent that. So all this, I mean, I was not in this position, but I would have been in this position. I would have felt that this is a difficult situation. So it's not just he had an absolute or relative majority in the House, he could keep it and govern as he wanted. He was increasingly in a tense situation. And he could just not continue like that, especially when his candidate was receiving 14% of the vote and the National Rally 34%. So, and especially there were two big questions ahead. One was the discussion about the budget, which was coming, and France is heavily into debt. So this budget had to be an austerity budget, and he didn't have the political strength to do that. And there were also, that perhaps is less important, but I still think about it, the Olympic Games is coming. And many commentators were saying, okay, the Olympic Games are going to be very tough to organize from the security point of view. It's going to be a very big challenge and so on. So he had two major challenges which required him to be strong, and he was not. And so I think to some extent he was obliged to look for another government if he was unable to do that, or to renew his legitimacy in this way. Do you think this calendar and this weakness of Macron could have played a role in his decision to dissolve the National Assembly?
Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that the president in the French political system has a very particular role compared to what he has in other European countries, including countries where the president is directly elected. So this is probably going to change in the next weeks and months due to the outcome of the legislative elections. But at least in the last years, he has really been the dominant figure. And that means that the decision to call for early elections was really his own decision, not only because formally he's the one who decides, but because also that came as a total surprise. There was no discussion ahead of the European elections of the possibility of such a snap election. And it seems that even the very little kind of, not control, but consultations that the president is supposed to do before calling for early elections, even that was done in a very superficial way. So it means it's very difficult to answer your question, because basically no one knows what went in his mind to decide. So we are left to speculate on the constraints that he was facing, the how he was anticipating on the future, like as you mentioned, the possibility that it would have been very difficult to govern in the next month due to the outcome of these European Parliament elections. So frankly speaking, I don't know. I can only speculate. But what seems to me quite clear, I mean, what we know is what he did before. And the first thing is that in 2022, so 2 years ago, there were presidential elections. Macron was re-elected. There was a legislative election. The outcome of this legislative election was that there was no absolute majority for the party of Macron, so for the MPs of the coalition, because it's not only one party. And he decided first to go for minority government, but without understanding that it was a minority government. So they already put themselves in a kind of a difficult situation, kind of pretending that they're the majority, but not having the majority, which explains what you just described in terms of passing important reforms, such as the pension reform. And the other thing that...
By force, yeah.
Yes, basically by having this procedure, which is allowed by the Constitution, and which in fact is done exactly for this kind of situation. When you don't have a clear majority, you can pass a law without a vote of the parliament. And the only possibility for the parliament to stop the law is by voting a motion against the government, which was not possible before this weekend, because the left in the parliament didn't want to unite their votes with the extreme right.
Right, yeah.
But the other point, I think, which is important in understanding the political dynamic in France, is that actually following this very difficult reform of the pension system, there was a change of government. Emmanuel Macron decided to have a new prime minister, hoping that it would create a dynamic and to perform better in the European Parliament elections. This did not happen, but the consequence was that he could not anymore say, okay, I understand.
You say before the pension reform, you meant after the pension reform. There was
yes,
a new
after the pension reform, but before the European Parliament elections.
Yes.
So that was a kind of I mean, it was presented, I don't know, again, I never discussed this directly with President Macron, but all the commentators were saying, well, he's doing this change of government in order to create a political dynamic that would support
Yes.
The campaign of his party in the European Parliament elections. What I'm trying to say is simply that after the European Parliament elections, it did not really have the possibility anymore to change the government, which would normally have happened when the
Yes.
dominant party has a defeat in a kind of a midterm election.
Yes.
The normal thing to do would be to change the government. But
Yes.
this was not
You
a
could not do
possibility
that.
anymore because it had been done before.
Yeah. No, he was cornered, and he was cornered because it was increasingly difficult for him to have support for his reforms. And this leads us probably to the next stage, which is that we cannot dissociate this episode from the overall predicament in the country. The budget crisis, which is not. It doesn't say its name, but there is a budget crisis in France because France has had a regular increase in its public deficit year after year. And now the debt has reached abysmal levels. Then you have also, that's the way also I perceive it, but perhaps you perceive it differently. But I think there is also, on the top of the budget crisis, a security crisis in the country. There were last year a repeat of big riots of 2005 in the suburbs, except that those from last year were much more widespread than those of 2005. They affected the very center of Paris, in contrast to those of 2005. The Rue de Rivoli was looted. Major stores were looted. So there was, for a while, a collapse in public order. And precisely those who were anxious about the Olympic Games also fear something similar during the Olympic Games, and it would be disastrous for the image of the country abroad. So I think many of the things that we are going through this month have the roots, the short root at least, in what happened 1 year ago with the pension reform in the spring, the big riots in June. And this really weakened Macron, and it's part and parcel of the overall predicament the country is facing. So now we have the results of these elections is that the big winners are nevertheless a national rally, even though they did not have as many members of parliament than they expected, and the far left party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, la France Insoumise, which also has emerged not only as a big force in the National Assembly, but also as a kind of a center of the left-wing coalition. And these two parties are radical parties opposed, diametrically opposed to the kind of policies that has been that of Mr. Macron and even previous governments. So do you share this assumption of a very unstable political life, which is itself rooted in a unique predicament facing the country from the budget point of view, from the security point of view?
Well, I think if you look at opinion polls, there is the first concern for the French people, at least what they say when they are asked, has to do with inflation, the purchasing power of citizens, which has been diminished by the crisis that has, I think, affected not only France but most countries in Europe, especially with the energy prices, which have increased very much. So that's when you look really at the polls, it really tops the different concerns of citizens by far. And then also still very high are concerns about poverty, inequalities, which usually come a third or fourth after the question of crime and security. So this is something that may explain both votes that you mentioned for the extreme right, for the national rally, which of course has been capitalizing on this feeling, and also which has very cleverly maybe shifted a little bit his discourse in pointing out this problem in the first place, and of course that has also benefited for left-wing parties. Just to mention,
obviously
and maybe we'll come back to that.
They do that opportunistically because they have nothing to propose about it, but they make it a headline in their platform, but they have nothing to propose about that.
Well, that it's not for me to say. I think everyone can look at what they are proposing and make their mind about if it's relevant and could be efficient. But what I wanted to mention, just to maybe bring a bit of nuance on the electoral sequence and the outcome, is that in fact I would say that I'm not so sure that La France Insoumise, I think in English is France Unbound.
And both, yeah.
Has been came out as the winner of the election, because actually that was a surprise in the European Parliament election that they came only fourth after Ensemble, which is basically the presidential majority, but also next to the Socialist Party. So it kind of reversed the result of the preceding European Parliament election. So and now they appear to be very divided for at the national level in the recent legislative elections. So I think this electoral sequence benefited much more the moderate, let's say, left than the far left represented by LFI.
Yeah, it didn't prevent Jean-Luc Mélenchon from going on stage on Sunday night and claiming the title of Prime Minister, not directly for himself, but at least for his coalition and probably for his party. He made a speech on Sunday night, so saying he was about to enforce now, to implement all the reforms they had in mind. So he claimed victory, like many, but what you say is that he may not be as victorious as he suggests. So you are probably less. As a result, I deduce that you are less pessimistic than I am on the situation of the country, because the worse the situation in the country, the more people are going to vote for radical parties like his or Marine Le Pen's party. So you think that voters have nevertheless somehow backed traditional parties, which slightly weaken the idea of a major crisis in the country?
No, I think very clearly what we see in France now is a kind of a polarization of political life. I mean, if I look at the National Assembly, but also I think in the European Parliament delegation, the French parliamentary delegation to the European Parliament, very clearly there is a kind of a polarization. So that's something which is, of course, not new, but which is reinforced.
Do you think this campaign has been more violent than others?
I don't know, but I would say it's almost a different issue. I mean, I'm just looking at the votes and for what parties voters have voted, and the outcome is rather clear. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, as everyone has noticed, the National Rally is doing better than ever. And that means that yes, there is this polarization, which is
polarization generally goes hand in hand with more political violence, because the less people share in terms of ideas and political opinion, the more aggressive they may be towards one another.
At least it makes it very difficult also to build a coalition and to govern together. And you just mentioned that Jean-Luc Mélenchon yesterday evening, so Mélenchon, the leader of La France Insoumise, was on stage to say, we want to govern, and he said it's our program and it's all of our program and it's only our program, which in a sense is, in my view, a little bit unrealistic, because even the coalition that he represents, so not only LFI but the all of the left, received 28% of the votes in the first round of this legislative election.
Yeah.
So it's a bit more than a quarter of the voters, and to pretend that they could decide on their own without negotiating with the other parties is unrealistic, I think.
Yeah, but here comes the type of voting that you were mentioning earlier for European Parliament elections. That is, even though you start with a low score, you can have very high number of members of parliament due to the electoral system. But what matters also is that even this coalition is very far from having a majority in the House. So, as you say, it's a bit unrealistic for him. Except we go for a scenario that we were also discussing, that is, you use the instruments in the Constitution to govern without a majority. But I don't think Macron will give this opportunity to Mélenchon or or even to the left to nominate one of them as prime minister and allow them to use these instruments and govern without a majority. I think here Macron has some room of maneuver. He's not obliged to call Mélenchon or someone else from the left to create a government, as far as I have understood. So he keeps some power, and he will prevent this kind of scenario of government without a majority, but this time not from his party, from another party in the left.
Well, the first thing I would like to say here is regarding the outcome of the election, of the legislative election, the election that we had yesterday and the week before. We have in France, contrary to all other European countries, but the UK, a majoritarian electoral system.
Yes.
It's a two-round electoral system. And one big argument in favor of the system in the past, I mean, there were two actually arguments. One was that with a majoritarian electoral system, you automatically had a majority. And that meant capacity to govern and to provide some stability. So that was one argument. And the other argument against changing the system in favor of a proportional electoral system, such as the ones that you can find across Europe, was to say, well, can you imagine if we had a proportional electoral system, the National Front at the time, which was performing or receiving 15 or 20% of the votes, would have 15 or 20% of the seats in the National Assembly. And that would be horrible, according to these commentators. Well, now what we see after 2022 and after this last election is that you can have a majoritarian electoral system and no clear majority coming out of that, and the rise of the National Front. So, and even the possibility of the National Front having an absolute majority in parliament. So that's something new for France. And the paradox is that we now have an assembly which probably is not exactly proportional, but which comes closer to proportionality than in the past. And now the parties, they have to deal with this new reality.
Yeah. So we have analyzed the causes of what has happened, the special status of European Parliament elections, and how here in that case, and why in that case they led to early elections. So due to the political context and the previous choices made by Macron, now we have analyzed also what has happened during these various elections, the results, who, if any, are winners. So you suggest that actually the moderate left is somehow also benefiting from this situation, but there is no clear winner. I do maintain that this result demonstrates that there is a big crisis in the country. Many voters are moving towards parties with more radical platforms. But let's move on now with the possible prospects for the country of these elections. Now that we have the result, but we don't have the full result, because I understand that things will have to be decided. We don't know exactly, given this National Assembly, what the next government will look like. There is some room of maneuver in the institutions to go in one direction or another. But nevertheless, we can have some picture to discuss some possible consequences. The one consequence, which was heavily discussed in June, was the possibility of France breaking away or becoming a very turbulent member of the European Union. There were already people writing opinion pieces saying how the EU can survive without France. I think now the possibility of such a scenario is very diminished, at least in the current political conditions. We don't know when there will be the 2027 elections. Because so already the National Rally has not anymore in its platform to exit the European Union, but there is something they have not really understood, that many of their propositions are just not compatible with the EU. For instance, restoring internal border controls. And so the possibility of Brexit seems to me out for now, for the foreseeable future. I was also thinking that actually the result that we have may be the best possible for the EU, because there is no clear winner. And this means that, an option is still that there will be no political government. There will be a government just dealing with current affairs, but no government trying to make sweeping changes in French politics. And this, given the platforms of all parties, was not good. If you take the platform of the left, of the National Rally, and even of Mr. Macron, it was, this is often the case in elections, who is going to give the most to voters? They were all making promises that were not funded. They were all saying, oh, I'm going to lower taxes here, I'm going to increase spending there, but none of them had any money to do that. So the fact that none of them has any majority is probably better for the budget of the country, and therefore for the stability of the Eurozone, and therefore the European Union. But we don't know. We don't know if we will have a government, for instance, of one of the three, probably the left, governing without a majority. We don't know. But if we stick to the scenario in which we don't have a government implementing a platform, that's probably the best for the EU. So we are far, at least for the foreseeable future, from a Brexit. It may happen. I'm not saying that it may happen later, but we are far from that now. So already, what do you think about this prospect? Do you think it's a good outcome for the EU or not?
Maybe one thing that I should remind people who are listening to us, if they are not familiar with the French institutions, is that there is one peculiar rule in the Constitution that the president can call for early election, but once it has been done, he cannot do it again for 1 year. So there is one thing that is sure regarding French politics. I'm always very careful in predicting what is going to happen in the future. But at least there is one thing we can be about sure, is that there will be no snap election within the next year. And that also acts as a strong constraint on the actors, because they have to deal with that and to take that into consideration now when they are considering the possibility to form a government. The other very important point is that constitutionally, the president is nominating the prime minister, and basically he can choose whoever he wants. But because there is a big but, there is another condition that is basically just going the way around, is that the government needs to have the support of the National Assembly. It's not possible to have a government without the support of the National Assembly. So, and then these two realities have to come
precisely
together.
Because of the instrument you were mentioning earlier, the motion against the government. If there is a majority in the House to against the government, then the president, the government has to present its demission.
So if we look at the composition of the National Assembly, I think it's very clear no party or even no coalition now has majority. I think the other, fear that we can take for granted is that no party is going into a coalition with the National Rally. So that limits the possibilities. In fact, as you mentioned, maybe 2 or 3 is like to have a kind of a coalition that would emerge between the centrist parties and a part of the left. And that's something that I would not exclude, to have a minority government of the left, but I think it's going to be very difficult. And
I don't think Macron will allow them to do that. If he can avoid, and they would not even have the majority in any case.
Well, yeah, I don't think it's Macron who would avoid that. I think it's simply that they might face a motion and have to go. And then that would be a big problem for Macron, because if he chooses a prime minister and then the majority vote against this prime minister, the credibility of Macron also is diminished. So he has to make sure that if he, and I think actually it didn't happen in the recent history, or it didn't happen ever in the French Fifth Republic, this situation. So
is it good for the EU or bad?
Well, I was going to the third possibility
compared to what could have happened.
Yeah, but I wanted to mention a third possibility that would be more like a technocratic government. The way that existed in Italy, also in Belgium, I think. Well, I think depending on what comes out, I mean, what possibility, it's not exactly the same thing from the perspective of the EU. I think what we see from experiences across Europe is that the EU can accommodate a lot of different situations.
Yes.
Look at the government of Italy. I mean, we could have thought that it would also be the end of the EU, and the EU shows.
No, but what I meant is that the National Rally had a number of propositions that are incompatible with the EU. That's one aspect. It doesn't mean that they are going to exit straight away, but there will be an increasing clash. The left had proposals that will just increase public deficit, and France is already under a procedure from the European Commission about its excessive deficit. So in both, if we had a victory of one of the two, we had a major problem with the EU going on. And I was checking the French spread on 10-year bonds, the French spread with German bonds, and it increased rapidly in June after Macron called for European national elections. I think primarily due to the fear that the National Rally could have a majority. Then it stabilized between the two rounds of the legislative elections, precisely because it became increasingly difficult for the National Rally to have a majority. And apparently in the last hours, in the hours after the results, it declined again. That is showing that investors consider there is a lower risk now with French debt. And I think the explanation could be the one I was saying, that now if we have a technical government that is not going to do any politics, that is not going to do any of the unpaid electoral gifts that had been promised during the election, the country, the fiscal position of the country will be better. So that's in that sense that I think to some extent what happened may have been the best, but we still don't know. The actors, as you are saying, will determine how it evolves. But if we stay with the technical government, that may be a rather good outcome for the EU until the next elections. And then there are two other things we were mentioning, though the fiscal crisis itself. So independently of the EU, it will not get better for sure. But if we stay like this, it may not get worse. If we stay with purely technical government, may not get much worse. It's already very bad. And there is also what I think is a security crisis in the country, with riots, violence, a kind of increasing difficulty to enforce law and order in the country. I mean, that's the feedback I think I receive from the country, and I think that's also what explains a very big chunk of the success of the National Front or National Rally. In that case, I don't think it will get any better. But you seem to consider there is no real security crisis in the country.
Well, I mean, there is insecurity, that's for sure. But I don't know if there is a crisis in the sense that there would be something special, like a big change that would have happened. there is insecurity, like in all countries. You can have crime, robberies, or criminals that exist. I'm not so sure that the figures shows a stark increase in the last years. Actually, what we have is, as you said, you mentioned the riots. That is limited events that in time, very shocking events, but that does not really reflect the reality of the daily life of many people. So I think the difficulty here is to assess correctly the perception and the reality, but also the perception is important and it has some effects. I mean, it's not as it is irrelevant. When people feel unsafe, insecure, that's something to be taken into consideration. And I think the political parties should really address this concern. I mean, especially those who claim they want to fight against a national rally or avoid the national rally getting into government. They have to be very careful to address the concerns of those voters. Basically, you have now 1/3 at least of the voters in France that vote for the extreme right on a regular basis. And that's not something that you can simply forget after the election.
So do you think the country getting worse or better in the next until the next elections?
I am optimistic. So, generally speaking, independent of the election, again, for me, the important point is really the question of the proportionality. Because I think one problem, particular problem that we have had in France, I mean, in the political system, because I'm an expert in the political system. I'm not an expert on insecurity, for instance. But one problem with the political system is not only the disproportionality of the electoral system, because that also exists in other places, but it's really, in my view, the fact that the political elites, they tend to forget about this disproportionality of the electoral system. And just after the election, they kind of have the impression that because they came first, they can govern as if they received more than 50% of the votes. And that's really the big problem, I think. And now, that's one reason why I'm optimistic, is that we have a situation where they are forced to see this reality that no party has the support of more than 50% of the voters, but not even 40% of the voters. In fact, they are far from 40% of the voters. So, and again, it's not something that is new. It's new in the National Assembly, but it's a reality of the electorate for many decades.
Yes, we had that yesterday night, in which you had the left and the left media partying as if it was 1981 and the left has won, the left is back into power. And the reality is that as you say, they had something like less than 30% of the vote in the first round, much less than the national rally.
In the first round, it was 28%.
28, okay. So, and in the second round, they don't even have an absolute majority, and we don't even know if they will form a government. And if they do, it would be extremely fragile. So,
28 is not so bad. I mean, if you compare to 2 years ago, the then majority was at 25%.
In the first round, but we are talking about a coalition of parties which, as you know, have also a number of internal disagreements, whereas these 25% you mentioned were more for a single bloc.
But it's the same. I mean, it doesn't change the fact that with 25% of the voters, you cannot claim to be the absolute majority of the voters. It's Leipart. Leipart says there are two conceptions of democracy, right? One conception is
what is it, Leipart?
Arndt Leipart, the political scientist, yes, the theoretician of consensus democracies. In Patterns of Democracy, he says you have two conceptions of democracy. One is 50%. Democracy, basically, it's government of the people. And the people is either 50% plus one of the voters, or if it's it's more encompassing, and it's almost all the population. And from this, he derives two models of democracy, like majoritarian one and consensus democracy. But in France, we are not even close to this majoritarian conception of democracy, where it's 50% of the population, because we pretend to have a majority with 25 or 28% of the voters. So it's very far from even this majoritarian conception of democracy.
Yeah. So yeah, to try to conclude in this episode, even though it's hard to conclude at this stage, at least my take on that is that we see, I agree with you, we have a polarization, which demonstrates an increasingly tense political life, which itself derives, that's my opinion, and you have some reservations about that, is that this situation, this polarization derives from the increasingly difficult situation of the country, at least from the budgetary point of view. From the social economic point of view, the situation in France is getting increasingly difficult. It doesn't mean that France is getting much poorer than the rest, but it is not on a good path. That's my opinion. And this has repercussions in the political life with this polarization, and the traditional government parties are increasingly narrowed, and now they would have to ally from the socialists to the Gaullists in order to have just a simple, an absolute majority, which is unprecedented. So that's the first conclusion. We can have an increasingly intense political life. And as far as the future is concerned, I think to some extent, on the one hand, it's the least bad outcome that could happen, because at least no party will be able to govern. This is a completely different conclusion than most other commentators. Most other commentators say, oh, it's terrible, there will be no government in France. France cannot stay without a government. No, I think the opposite. I think given what was proposed, a government that is not going to increase even more spending and just manage technical affairs is at least less bad than the other options. The worst option was obviously the National Rally, because of the hatred in this party, and they lost because of that. We have not discussed this aspect so much, but this party play on its ambiguities. That is, they appeal to people who have racist perspectives, but they pretend not to be racist. So, and at some point, the two clash with one another, and this became visible during the last stages of the campaign, when a number of candidates of that party were caught with racist behavior or declarations. So this was obviously the worst outcome for the hatred it creates, and therefore the violence it will trigger in the country. But from the economic point of view, the others were not much better than the National Rally. So if we go for at least a pause in government in France for the next months or even years, actually that may be good. But then for later, I think this political system is going into further polarization. At some point, National Rally may make it. They were not far. I was listening to an important member of the National Rally saying that in 100 MP elections, they were at 2 percentage points of the majority. So they were very close. So there is no, if the budgetary crisis and perhaps a security crisis get worse, they could perfectly have a majority within 3 years. So I let you the last word. I leave you the last word before we stop here.
Yes, indeed. We enter in a zone of uncertainty. And regarding the National Rally, I checked some figures, so I don't know how reliable they are, because the way the second round is organized in France, you don't have elections in every constituency, because MPs have been elected sometimes in the first round. It depends on who the candidates are, but it seems that the National Rally got 37% of the votes yesterday. So increasing his score from the first round. 37.
37.
37. Okay. So increasing his score from the first round and coming first very clearly in terms of share of votes in the second round of the election, after performing also very well in the first round. So that has to be checked, but that seems to make sense regarding the way the elections are organized and what we know of the mood in France. So indeed, this election does not solve everything, far from it. And I would say also that somehow the National Rally could benefit of any scenario coming out of this election, because if we have a kind of a coalition between the moderate left and the moderate center and right, they will say, well, look, it's the political elite that ally against us and that do not want to listen to the people. And in fact, it's the same left and right. It's all the same. So that would be a very strong argument for them. And if there is no stable government or a technical government for other reasons, they would say, well, you have been deprived of your preference and the people have not been listened to. So I think that makes it very challenging for the French political system in the next years. But I mean, the big lesson of all that is that it's very unpredictable. I mean, no one in France had predicted this snap election in 2024. No one. I mean, so we don't know what can happen in 1-2 years, even. I mean, without even thinking of 2027, which is supposed to be the next presidential election.
Thank you. So, Julien, where can people follow you and your various comments and works?
Thanks to you for the invitation.
You are on Twitter, no? Where can people follow you?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm on Twitter. Yes, indeed.
That's the best way to follow your
and Blue Sky as well now.
Blue Sky, I don't know this one. What is it?
Yes. Well, it's a kind of an alternative to Twitter, which has a bit developed since Twitter has become X.
Okay, and so your handle on Twitter is Navarro.
Julien 4, maybe something like that.
Navarro, Julien 4. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Julien, and stay tuned for another episode of the podcast in which we will discuss the current political conditions in Europe.